How you doing, Michael?
Oh, I've been doing well. I was actually didn't hear all that previous commercial, the one that was really fast, because I was trying to listen to a voicemail at the same time.
Well, you didn't miss anything. So, didn't get to talk to you last week. We were up in Albuquerque about this time on the air with state softball action, and but we're back and we're ready to go. And so, what is our what journey are you going to take us on today, Michael?
The journey is going to be a journey to the 21st century.
Okay.
Specifically, we're about to open a new exhibit, and I just wanted to let people know what museums do to prepare exhibits.
Okay.
So when museums work on exhibits, the very first thing we do before anything else is sit down with pen and paper and ask ourselves, what do we want to talk about? What is our goal? What is our objective for this exhibit? What's the message we want to convey? What's the overall theme? And once we determine that, then we can actually start with the exhibit design process. But exhibits are always something bigger than just putting photos up on the walls.
Sure.
And so once that is done, we begin the research, but almost always we have to do some research to prepare ourselves for the research. Take, for example, the exhibit that's going to open at the end of the month on fashion. Before looking through photos and information on Artesia and fashion, we have to first research the overall concepts of fashion and the fashion for the era that we want to look at. So that means a lot of reading, a lot of research. And then from there, we can actually do research on what the museum has, what we can find on the local history.
Mm-hmm.
So exhibits, we always look at the greater picture, and we use the greater picture to help us look at the local picture. And then from there, we can actually do research on the materials from the collection. So in this case, it meant after reading books and reading journals, we moved on to looking through historical photographs in the collection, looking through actual clothing in the collection, and looking through newspapers and magazines that we have over here.
Because you can get an idea of fashion trends by what people wear in the pictures or what advertisements are in the magazines.
Exactly. And what was available, too.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And then from there, we then actually sit down and determine what will the exhibit look like? What will be the flow of the exhibit? What areas are we going to cover? Create an outline, and then transform the outline into a drawing and a map of the exhibit space. And then from there, we can actually start preparing text panels and image panels on the computer first, of course. You have to use publishing software, type up everything, make sure the images are centered on the panels, make sure it looks good, make sure there's no typographical errors, no spelling errors, no factual errors, a lot of proofreading.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can actually print. Now, for some exhibits, for some museums, they'll use a lot of exhibit cases, which means preparing special mounts in the cases to hold artifacts.
Okay.
Like if it's a small artifact, you want to have it displayed in a way that people can see it. There's various ways you can have it displayed. You can have it dangling from something. You can have it just laid out on something. You could prepare little platforms to set things on so you can see at different heights. And that takes a lot of time, and you have to make sure the materials you use are safe for artifacts, so that they won't off-gas, they won't deteriorate in the exhibit cases, that the materials themselves aren't a hazard to the artifacts, that they're not contaminated with anything that could harm the artifacts, or even worse, that they don't have, like, bugs in them.
Right.
There are bugs that will eat artifacts.
And you don't want to have them be exposed to other artifacts in addition to the one you're trying to protect.
Oh, definitely. And then on top of all that, certain types of exhibits, you have to ask yourselves, is the artifact itself unsafe? What sort of additional protections do we need to use?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, artifacts could be radioactive. Artifacts could be contaminated with something that's hazardous to health that people nowadays know it's hazardous, but back then they didn't. Like mercury, arsenic, things that are used in the manufacture of silk, and manufacture of silk clothing, silk hats, things like that. You have to ask yourself, is this going to be hazardous?
Lead, asbestos, other things like that.
Definitely. And then from there, once you have the exhibit cases prepared, you have to start preparing the text panels themselves, the physical part of it. And over at the museum, we, since our exhibits are typically out for just anywhere from 1 to 6 months at a time, we use a foam board, and we print off the text, and we print off the photographs. We spray adhesive on the backs of the paper. We put it on the foam board. We then put a little bit of wax paper over it to create a sort of a non-sticky barrier, and then we put weights on them to hold them down. And then when that's finally done, then we can grab a utility knife or an X-Acto knife, and we can cut out the completed frames or completed images. Then everything gets mounted on the walls, mounted on the temporary walls, put inside of exhibit cases. You have to make sure the exhibit is actually clean and presentable, particularly the floors, the windows. You have to make sure the lighting is good. If you need to check to see if anything needs to be adjusted, if light bulbs need to be replaced. For some exhibits, that's a lot more involved, because in our arts center we do not have track lighting that could be angled, but some museums do. You have to make sure that the light is ideal for highlighting things, or you have to make sure it's not pointing directly at artifacts that could be damaged by too much light.
Sure. Or get in the eyes of people that are trying to see the artifacts.
Or create uncomfortable glare from bouncing off things that shouldn't bounce off of.
Right.
So there's a lot that goes on, and after all of that, you still have then you have the grand opening.
Mm-hmm.
You open the doors. So all this all together, it's hundreds of hours of work just for one exhibit.
Especially if you want it well researched and well documented and to be very nice and presentable when people come in. You want people to go, wow, that was really nice. And that those are the kind of comments that you want to hear, not issues with the display or the setup.
Oh, definitely. You want to make sure that everybody enjoys it, and everybody, more importantly, everybody learns from it.
Right. So with all of the research you're talking about and all the prep for this fashion exhibit that's coming up, was there a time period that you settled on?
Yes. The goal was 1905. Specifically 1905. We did go a little bit over into 1906 and a little bit under in 1904. And some of the materials are from a catalog from 1902. However, fashion as it made it out this way, it was pretty stable during that decade, during those 5 years. So I don't feel any discomfort with using a 1902 catalog to talk about 1905.
Mm-hmm.
The big changes in fashion that you see, that happens in big cities, not so much in Artesia.
Sure. I mean, eventually some fashion trends will make their way here, but not the fresh new items immediately making here. That may be different today, but certainly in 1905. What was the dominant material that was used in the fashions of the day?
Wool.
Wool, okay.
Yeah, this was before the era of most artificial fabrics that we know today. So rayon, that was being slowly imported over from England. The first rayon factory did not open until they started building in 1909. in the United States. So rayon was rare in the United States, and it was used as an artificial silk for highlights and details on clothing, especially dresses.
Right.
So you think like silk collars on jackets and shirts, things like that. That would have been rayon. But rayon was not a major thing over here. Polyester did not exist. Nylon did not exist. The only other artificial materials that you'd find would be like artificial rubbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like for waterproofing, you would find various oils and latexes used. But beyond that, and rubber, I'm not sure if rubber could be considered an artificial material because it's from the rubber tree, but they process it heavily with sulfur to vulcanize it.
Well, I need to reach out, because it's kind of interesting to see. So everything was wool? Everything? I mean, shirts, jackets?
Oh, not everything.
Everything?
Not everything, but it was the predominant material for outer clothing that people wore.
Okay. So if it wasn't...
There would...
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, there were also, of course, with anything, there were blends. And during the time of the year, you'd find different materials. You might find, linen and cottons would be worn during the summer months. But even then, looking at photos, it's obvious that people were still wearing their wool clothing during the summer months.
Right, because that was what was available. So, did people make their own clothes in 1905, or did they go down to the to the feed store, or the general store, I guess would be more accurate, the general store, and buy pre-made clothes?
Well, the dry goods store is what they called it.
Okay.
But they did have both. They had pre-made clothing. They had they had three categories, actually, to think about it. You had the ready-to-wear clothing. You had the tailored clothing, where they would go to the general store, or they're called dry goods store.
Mm-hmm.
They go to the dry goods store, they get their measurements taken, and then the measurements would be sent off to a tailor, whether in town or outside of town. Or they could go to the dry goods store and buy patterns and fabric by the yard and just make their own.
Make their own. Interesting. And did this was men and women, pretty much the same for both?
Pretty much, although this exhibit focuses on menswear, because women's clothing, that would be its own exhibit completely too. There's just so much involved in it.
Sure. Did you get the opportunity to focus on footwear or hats or other accessories, or are you focusing just pretty much on the main clothes that everybody wore?
Well, those are covered too. Unfortunately, we do not have shoes from the era. It's interesting what people chose to donate. For the most part, it was when people donated things to the museum, they didn't think to donate their daily clothing. So we had some suits, some daily type clothing, but a lot of what we have also in the collection is sort of fancy one-time use clothing, like wedding suits.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not entirely the sort of clothing that people wore on a daily basis. So that's why the exhibit is a bit focused more on photographs and illustrations than it is on clothing from the collection.
Sure. Actual artifacts themselves on that.
And what's great about the exhibit is how much I was able to find from the Artesia Advocate from the era. And that really does show what was available and what people could buy, more so than anything else, really.
Right.
The Artesia Advocate advertised the businesses that were in town that sold clothing.
Right. And there were, I'm sure, a lot more than today. It's kind of limited today. There's a few, but maybe back then there were just a few then.
Well, there were a few major ones, and some stores also sold clothing on special occasions. That was interesting. The Pecos Valley Drug Company, they focused on sundries and drugs and medicines and things like that, but they sold, during back-to-school season, they sold school clothing.
Yeah.
That was a thing back in 1905.
Getting
People,
the school for clothes. Or get the clothes for school. What's the matter with me? I got that twisted, didn't I?
and even the major stores like the Joyce Pruitt store, they advertised back-to-school clothing.
So much bigger thing than maybe today.
It's one of the things that has been around since the existence of schools. Parents always want their kids to look presentable, and stores always want parents to spend money. So it works out for everybody. So
going back to your preparation for an exhibit, what do you hope people will learn from going through the fashion exhibit, the 1905 fashion exhibit?
Well, I hope people will learn that while clothing, fashions, and materials have changed significantly over the past 17 years, I hope they learn that things really aren't as different as they think, that the past is quite similar to the present, that you find that cloth itself has not really changed, even though it's all polyester nowadays, that clothing and styles may superficially look different, but it's all still functionally the same, and that consumerism itself, nowadays people talk about how television is just nonstop ads. Look through the Artesia Advocate. You find large ads telling people that they need to buy clothing to be good people. That spending money means that you're a good citizen.
That's right. You want to look your best when the kids go to school. So, yeah.
And not just going to school. It's like it's the 4th of July. Buy a new suit.
Well, yeah. Why not? So, commercialism.
I'm not sure if I include that ad in the exhibit too or not. I think I did. But that was, there's some interesting ads, and that's part of the exhibit. It's just the ads themselves, what people are seeing every time they open the newspaper.
Yeah, pretty cool. When does the exhibit open?
The exhibit opens on May 28th.
May 28th, and how long will that exhibit be available?